This week's topic was global fisheries. We talked about why fisheries are important. We discussed the problem structure of managing fisheries. We discussed the state of global fisheries and other problems associated with this management before turning towards different institutional structures that have been developed to manage global fisheries. We then turned to the historical evolution of the seafood regime, and finally discussed China's emergent efforts to shape global fisheries rules. We discussed why fisheries are important. It's an important source of nutrition for many people around the world. It's a large source of income and employment. The global fish trade generated some $164 billion in 2018 in revenue, and that accounted for nearly 40% of the world's caught or farmed fish. In the US alone, some 1.2 million people are employed in fisheries. Fisheries are important also as sources of biodiversity, and that is another factor that makes them important in the wider ecosystems and food chains. Fisheries have classic problems of commons. They are rival goods in which there's a limited number of fish, but there are challenges of excludability given that it's difficult to prevent access from different actors taking the fish, particularly in the open oceans. The commons problems, as you recall, have problems of overuse in which actors are incentivized to use it or lose it. If they defer taking some number of fish, they fear others will, so there's that attribute. And while all actors have a common interest in reducing overfishing, they have individual incentives to take as much fish as they can, and that makes it a relatively malign problem for management given these mixed motives. Political economy factors associated with international fishing fleets are such that those fishing fleets want to maximize their year-round profits through consistent effort, but biological systems don't work like that. So there's a tendency for management systems to encourage over-extraction, and in times of scarcity, it's difficult to back away from those profit-seeking goals, something we'll talk about more in a bit. There are also challenges given emergent rules over exclusive economic zones, in that governance usually extends to 200 nautical miles offshore that allows a country to exercise exclusive domain over fisheries in that zone, but the fish don't respect those boundaries and will swim across them, and that is a challenge for management. Hannah Ritchie's take on the state of global fisheries is perhaps more sanguine than other fisheries experts. She notes that some 66% of global fish stocks are biologically sustainable, and some 34% are overexploited. That fraction of overexploited fisheries has increased over time, and there was real concern in the 1990s and 2000s that percentage would continue to rise inexorably. She makes the case that has flattened out a bit in recent years, and so that suggests some stabilization in fisheries stocks, where things are not getting that much worse, but they are more or less holding steady, although with considerable regional variation. So some of the worst fears of previous decades haven't been realized. And she attributes that to the rise of aquaculture in particular. So while the volume of wild-caught seafood has remained steady at around 90 million tons a year, aquaculture has risen from the late 1990s to eclipse in the mid-2010s the quantity of fish that are caught wild. So you have in excess of 100 million tons of fish that are farmed through aquaculture. Other reasons why Ritchie is optimistic or relatively optimistic about global fisheries, in that there used to be considerable problems of bycatch, where people are catching other species than the intended ones, and so they end up with 20% or more wastage of species that were caught that they may throw overboard because they hadn't intended to catch them. And that wastage percentage has decreased to around 10%, which is still too high, but is an improvement over before. Another reason Ritchie is relatively optimistic has to do with how aquaculture fish are fed, and she notes that the production of aquaculture now is more efficient production and plant-based foods for fish, so they're no longer relying heavily on wild-caught fish to feed aquaculture and farm-raised fish. Since 1950, the Food and Agricultural Organization notes that fisheries growth has exploded around the world, particularly in Asia, which now dominates much of the fisheries consumption. We now have a better portrait of fisheries hotspots around the world, in part because the International Maritime Organization requires large ships to broadcast their positions to avoid wrecks through these automatic identification systems. And while not all boats carry those, some of the largest boats that are responsible for a significant share of global fisheries do carry them, and that has provided some visibility into where fisheries are taking place and the volume of fishing activity. And organizations like Global Fishing Watch have provided periodic reports. One somewhat dated one from 2016 shows that China, followed by Taiwan and Spain, are the most active fishing nations. There are similar reports from other organizations that detail those fishing levels as well. And again, China leads in the level of effort for global fisheries as well. There are other problems associated with fisheries beyond the one of the commons. There are problems associated with flags of convenience, where vessel owners will register their boats with countries that have light regulatory rules, and fisheries management begins with enforcement by the flag state. So that's proven to be a problem over time, although some of the rules have enhanced the capacity of port states to regulate fisheries. There are other challenges associated with over-subsidization of fisheries by governments. So you have fleets that are able to operate internationally only because they have support from governments for fuel or other incentives that make them commercially viable when they otherwise might not be. There are challenges for many countries around the world to regulate fisheries because they have weak state capacity. There's also challenges of corruption. The technology to find and destroy fish has improved over time with enhanced detection techniques, both very technologically sophisticated sonar systems, now aerial spotting by helicopters, now drones. There are other challenges to fisheries from climate change, and then there's this broader issue of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, which constitutes a significant share of the global fisheries take, which is all related to these capacity problems that are both a function of weak states around the world that may have limited ability to oversee and enforce rules, but also the limited visibility on the open oceans for managing fish. And so some of the challenges that we saw with the oil pollution regime historically. There are different theoretical mechanisms to manage fisheries. These include technological limits, such as bans on particular kinds of nets or trawling techniques. There are input limits where actors have to get a permit before they can go out and fish. There are quotas that limit the taking, so to a certain sustainable yield. And then there are economic measures, so the extension or withdrawal of subsidies that encourage actors or discourage them from fishing. There are a variety of international mechanisms that have some bearing on fish. The International Maritime Organization is mostly responsible for regulating shipping. As I mentioned, to avoid wrecks, they insist on large boats having these transponders on them, which facilitates some management in the fisheries space. There are fisheries conventions, many of them regional. There's the 1982 Law of the Sea, which has extended the exclusive economic zone of countries to 200 nautical miles. That came into force in 1994. There are straddling stocks agreements for stocks that swim between EEZs and into global waters, and there are also conventions like CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, which are increasingly deployed to address aquatic species. Most of the conversation we had was about regional fisheries management organizations, so I'll talk a bit more about that. There's also the new High Seas Treaty, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty that we discussed earlier in the semester, which is intended to expand marine protected areas and will likely intersect with the fisheries management issue in coming decades. There are some 17 regional fisheries management organizations, 5 of which are dedicated to tuna. They've divvied up parts of the world into management zones to manage the fish in international waters and have it informed theoretically by scientific understanding of what the maximum sustainable yield or use can be from those fisheries, by setting quota systems and allocating them to different countries that have a vested interest in fish. The critique of these organizations is that they tend to be oriented around the interests of commercial fishermen as opposed to the needs of fish per se, and so there's a tendency to set those sustainable yield levels very high without enough cushion for uncertainty. So there's a tendency for those quota levels to run the risk of near crashes in population stocks, because perhaps there's insufficient information about the populations of those fish and their ability to reproduce, or there may be insufficient cushions should there be shocks to fisheries in terms of reproduction levels. And so there's the concern that many fisheries around the world run the risk of unsustainable harvests. We saw that in tuna in previous decades, where it was very difficult, even though the scientific evidence was clear that tuna numbers were and populations were at risk of major decline. Ultimately, there were agreements to rein in overexploitation of tuna, and they have rebounded in some fisheries much faster than expected. But there continues to be the concern that these RFMOs, Regional Fisheries Management Organizations, are oriented around serving the commercial fishing industry as opposed to managing for actual sustainability of those fisheries. Other challenges associated with those RFMOs is that there's often poor compliance with the rules, and it's difficult to conduct surveillance and have awareness of rules violations and then in turn punish violators. So the Law of the Sea Treaty tried to deal with the problem of the global commons by converting the global commons into more of a national commons by creating the exclusive economic zone. So the sovereign territorial waters of countries is 12 nautical miles, but the exclusive economic zone extends the zone that countries have exclusive rights to resources, now extends to 200 nautical miles under the law of the sea. And that basically converts a global commons into a national commons. And so that reduces the number of actors involved in management of fisheries, because many fish stocks reside in that 200 nautical miles jurisdiction. So there are still obviously fish in international waters, and fish do not respect those EEZ boundaries, as I suggested earlier, but this conversion of a global commons into a national commons reduces the number of actors that are responsible for regulation in those EEZs. The question is how much has that actually enhanced conservation efforts? And some of the challenges associated with EEZ management are that countries can still allow other countries' vessels to operate and harvest from their EEZs voluntarily, and that is all well and good, except they may have limited capacity to manage their EEZs and prevent illegal fishing in their waters. They may in turn maximize extraction from their national commons, either through their own efforts or by allowing foreign fishing vessels to extract from their waters. So there's still problems of that national commons, in that there's limited excludability inside those territories as well, particularly for countries that have weak state capacity and limited ability to extend their sovereign reach out that far. The other challenge of the EEZs, as I mentioned, is that the fish don't necessarily stay in them, and so you need to have agreements on managing fish that then make the move to the open oceans. And if that is still poorly regulated, then that may have a bearing on the sustainability of fish stocks around the world. So we talked about an interesting piece on the global environmental politics and political economy of seafood systems, which put into historical context U.S. and Japanese contestation in the middle of the 20th century over fishing, talking about there being kind of competing pelagic empires of countries seeking access to more fishing areas around the world. And the argument they make is that the U.S., for example, sought to protect its own domestic salmon fisheries, but extend its right to exploit international tuna fisheries. And so there's a bit of a contradiction and hypocrisy in the way the U.S. approached conservation of domestic species, but exploitation of international species. And then this particular piece tracks the deepening multinational internationalization of the fishing industry over time, and the evolution of efforts to regulate fish through market-based standards like the Marine Stewardship Council and competing efforts from the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation. And so this is a sort of critique of modern capitalism in this particular paper. Interesting countervailing or later example comes in the piece on China's approach to global fisheries power, which suggests that there's a similar dynamic at play as China has become the dominant actor with a large fishing fleet and presence and demand around the world, in that China's overexploited its domestic fishing waters and is now trying to regulate those, but its international presence to secure fish has expanded dramatically. And despite pushback from other countries that are concerned about their EEZs and fish stocks, there are many reports of Chinese fishing vessels operating just outside those EEZs and maintain very sophisticated fishing vessels that are serving the Chinese market. And China, in international fishing rules, is simultaneously seeking to maintain access to international fisheries, but be perceived as a responsible member of the international community by joining these fisheries management organizations and be a member and leader in good standing in those groups. That effort to serve as a member in good standing and a supporter of international legal regimes is a bit at odds with its practice and the fishing fleets that have extensive operations around the world. So that begs the question of what are the solutions to the fisheries problem. Some of them have to do with the extension of aquaculture and ensuring that there are adequate fish provided that way to put less pressure on wild-caught fish. There are new efforts through fisheries certification like the Marine Stewardship Council, which offer consumers more information about sustainably caught fish, although that may provide for only a small proportion of the market. There are efforts to use enhanced monitoring technology like those transponders to be able to monitor fish stocks more easily around the world. There have been efforts to enhance the port state capacity of countries that can manage their EEZs more effectively. There are technological efforts to reduce levels of bycatch. And ultimately, there needs to be more responsible fishing by top countries and pressure on China in particular to both manage its own fish stocks sustainably, but to work with other countries to reduce its pressure on fish stocks in key places around the world. And that may intersect with this new movement under the Marine Protected Areas, the BBNJ Treaty, to extend more marine protected areas around the world that will allow key biodiverse regions to recover from pressure from fishing, which would help support more sustainable fishing and healthy ecosystems around the world.